Broadcasting from the Planet Vero studios where the sun shines and everyone lives in air conditioning. I'm David Yak here, and this is certainly Yak About Tech, your GPS guide to everything technology with a few other things thrown in for good measure. So, Sally, how are you?
I'm great.
All right, now that we're actually on video here on Livestream, still in our experimental stage, and behind that camera and that wall is Wayne, making sure that things are going right. So I've been watching some of my fellow broadcasters over live stream, and I didn't notice how many of them stood up when they broadcast, and I really liked it. I like the idea of standing up because it's sort of healthier, and I think you're more energetic. You know what I have to do now that I didn't have to do before, now that we're on video? I used to have a guest, and we would bring in the guest, obviously, about 15 minutes into the show after we had our
time to do introductions.
Well, now I've got Douglas Bove, but everybody can see him.
And I'm just sitting here.
And he's just sitting there, and I should introduce him. So why don't we go a few pages and introduce Douglas. Today's topic is going to be on solar energy. We have, and he's a great guest. He's going to enlighten us about the technology and the economic implications of this renewable energy. So Douglas is an international development specialist whose work is centered on both microfinance strategies and business development in the emerging and frontier markets. And this summer, he is working for the U.S. government overseas in their Overseas Private Investment Corporation, OPIC. I think it's called OPIC, right?
Not to be confused with OPEC.
Right. And he has worked in austere environments around the world, including Haiti, Kenya, Uganda, Iraq, Rwanda, and Jordan. And I think when we get to the discussion, before we get into the solar energy part of it, maybe you'll take us through some of your experiences.
Sure.
And then we'll sort of hit it.
I've got a crush on him already.
Yes. And a lot of girls do. If you take a look at this guy, now everybody can take a look at him. All you have to do is walk down the street and see young women's hearts melting all the time. All right. So about standing up. So it got me thinking, Sally, that about all the exercise. You know how we've been talking with some of our California brethren about healthy eating and exercising, and we keep doing these
treadmill desks.
Well, I was just going to talk about that. But no, it's perfect. So what happened was, after I was watching people stand up and broadcast, I said, we need to do more of that. And then I had a discussion with a friend of mine, Chris, who's running, I think you'll remember him, Sally. He has the Lift Sessions, the new startup that's doing virtual training, exercise training. Right. Mm-hmm. And they're building out their new offices in Montreal. And the idea is they're not only putting up high desks, but they're also putting treadmill desks, like Doug says. And I think that's really interesting. You sit there and obviously you have to go to fairly slow speed.
Yeah, about 1 mile an hour, I think.
That type of thing. So you're just sort of slightly moving because you're typing and answering the phone and, well, not answering the phone, but probably talking on the computer. All right. So, again, a few things before we get to Doug. You know what I realized now, Sally? Now that we're actually live streaming video, if you think about it, we used to talk about it at the beginning of the show, and we used to talk about how we're just everywhere. We talk a lot about social media. But I sort of listed every place people can find Yak About Tech. So listen to this. You'll really love this. So we're on iTunes. We're on TuneIn Radio. We're on YouTube. We're on Livestream. We're on Stitcher. We're on SoundCloud. And we're on Instacast. So That's just listening to us and watching us now on live stream and on YouTube, because we also put the broadcast up on YouTube, right? And so that's where you can actually listen or watch the show. Is
Stitcher a podcast app?
Right. I'm sorry, say that again?
Is Stitcher a podcast app, or what is Stitcher?
Yeah, Stitcher's sort of a radio and podcast app, so you can actually bring in radio stations as well as subscribe to podcast.
I'm going to appeal to the voyeur in all of my friends and associates with the live stream, because actually it's on before we actually start recording. So you get a little bit behind the scenes and set up and conversation that is not necessarily intended to be out there.
Yeah, I was going to say, you get a little, that's right, it's the B-roll, but you also get a little bit of our personalities. But I dare say we don't exactly hide who we are when we're on the radio anyway. So I think people get a good sense of who we are. Anyway, just to continue, so that's the way you can listen to the show or view the show. But also, a lot of the topics that we pick for the show come from you guys out there. And sometimes you'll post it on Facebook.com/Yak About Tech, or sometimes we get it on Facebook.com/Planet Vero. And of course, there's a nice, healthy Twitter feed going at Yak About Tech, so we can have that conversation too. And of course, you find me. I get a lot of people on LinkedIn who are listening to the show, which I really think is interesting. And I do get a few questions and emails every week of things we should answer at yakabouttech@gmail. So let me go. We have time. Oh, good. So just a few things in the news. I saw something. I don't know if you saw this, Doug. You read you're a New York Times reader, right?
I am.
Right. And Sally, you ever follow Maureen Dowd in the Times? She's a columnist, op-ed columnist.
Honestly, no.
Okay. She's got an interesting personality. It doesn't matter what your political party is. She puts out hate messages about everybody. She'll find something wrong with everybody.
An equal opportunity offender.
That's right. So if there's a Republican office, she goes after the Republican. If there's a Democrat, you can't do anything right. But every once in a while, she'll do something interesting, like
eat a marijuana chocolate bar.
Oh yes, that's right.
Denver.
She ate the marijuana chocolate bar, and she got really stoned out of her mind, apparently, and couldn't function. And then she wrote an article on Colorado passing the marijuana laws. But she did talk about something that's particularly interesting to me, and I'll tell you the basics of the story. Everybody knows Uber in the room. Uber is the sort of taxi service. I'm
one of their best customers.
That's right. That's right. And you have your app, and you just push your thing, push a button, and a car turns around and arrives in front of you. It's really a radical improvement, especially, Sally, those of us who grew up out of New York City, waiting on the corners for cabs constantly, never being able to get one. So Maureen Dowd had such an interesting experience, and I don't know why it really registered with me, but she claimed she came out of her hotel or airport, I can't exactly remember what it was, and she pulled out her app and she called for a car. It must have been the airport because all the Uber cars were waiting. And all of a sudden, they were all sort of disappearing, but nobody's coming to her. And then one car came by and actually stopped by her.
Oh, yeah.
And she said, there were so many of you. Why did I have to wait this long? And the driver said, because you have a bad rating.
Oh.
And so what I found so interesting, because, you rate your Uber drivers, but the idea that the business is rating the customer is sort of a first.
It's interesting. Whenever I've taken Uber, or most recently when I've taken Uber, the driver says, I'll give you a 5-star rating if you give me a 5-star rating. And so it's almost like the system is now...
That was the conclusion that she came to, because obviously the driver will rate you if you don't tip enough, or if you're late and you're making them wait around. So there are various reasons.
That's interesting. It's kind of like the college kids rating their professors for each other.
It is. And I think that's an important point. I'm not sure exactly how I feel about that business model.
You know what? I like it. There's nothing worse than somebody that doesn't take care of a service person, and they should be tagged with that misbehavior.
There's also a safety issue involved there, especially for women that are at risk. There's been in the news a couple instances of Uber drivers allegedly committing assault, that sort of thing. And if you have no way of knowing whether this person that's going to pick you up is been vetted at all, that's an opportunity for you to feel safe.
Well,
Yeah.
actually, some areas have passed laws now. They have to have a level 2 background check. That's my daughter's business, and so she actually was telling us about that.
That's right. And also, they're building into the software. I think they released it in either Paris or in Spain, a panic button for the passenger. So the passenger can push a panic button built into the software. All right. Okay, so just a few things because when we don't have a lot of time. In fact, maybe we'll break for commercial. And we're back. I'm David Yak here. This is Yak About Tech, and we're here with Sally Dillon and Douglas Bove, and we're about to get into a discussion about solar energy. But first, leading into that discussion, there is one story I'd like to talk about. I think it's an appropriate intro into our discussion. Well, apparently, a fire broke out at an Apple facility in Mesa, Arizona. Firefighters were able to extinguish it before it burned anything inside the facility, and no injuries have been reported. Firefighters in Mesa, Arizona were called to the scene of a fire at an Apple facility. The second alarm blaze took over an hour to extinguish and apparently didn't burn anything inside the building. The fire appeared to be on the solar panels on the roof of the building over a loading dock.
Uh-oh.
The fire did not appear to be burning inside the building itself. No injuries were reported, and 12 people were evacuated from the facility, which Apple apparently plans to use as a data processing center.
Mesa is a very hot place with a lot of sun.
And bad electricians.
That'll lead us into our conversation with Doug. A little bit more about Doug. Doug currently is a master's candidate at Johns Hopkins University, Paul H. Nitze School of Advanced International Studies, where his concentration is energy, resources, and the environment, with a special focus on renewable energy project development for the developing world. He just returned from spending the year at SAIS campus in Bologna and in Italy, and will complete his studies this coming year in Washington, D.C. He's also a native of Vero Beach. So, Doug, before we get started, I know we're going to have about 15 minutes here, or less, actually, about 10 minutes. Tell the audience how solar energy works. What is it, and how does it work?
Sure. Well, there are two main types of solar energy. There's what most people are familiar with. Those are photovoltaic cells. Those are the kinds you put on your roof. And there's a direct current created when sun's energy hits the panels. And the other kind is CSP, that's concentrated solar power. And that's when you use an array of mirrors to direct solar light at a central water terminal that is then boiled, and then the steam is directed into a turbine.
Okay, and your concentration, and if I can say it the way you said it, is photovoltaics, and you just published a paper on this, and so...
Are we coming along on solar power?
Yeah, actually, so the scope of this paper was to talk about the direction of solar energy as like a push by society to really advance the technology and the economics along such that it sort of dovetails with our larger carbon emission reduction goals. And sort of the scope of the paper was to talk about how successful this has actually been. In fact, they've been so successful that it's sort of outpacing the ability of the government and regulators to sort of recalibrate the system in order to accommodate the more sclerotic, slower to move traditional utility companies that are responsible for maintaining the grid.
So I found this really interesting because, to me, this has a lot of implications. You write in your paper, today, home generation of electricity is no longer being adopted simply as a method for lowering the burden on traditional models of generation in an effort to reduce emissions, known as peak shaving. As costs have fallen and batteries capable of solving the intermittency problem proliferate thanks to companies like Tesla, uptake of residential solar has become driven more by the desire among homeowners to reduce or eliminate utility bills. In some cases, it's even possible for homeowners to profit from electricity generated by PV systems by selling energy back to the grid. This is the whole basic center of your paper.
Right.
You're saying things have changed and evolved to a point where and let me just step back. And tell me if I'm wrong, and maybe you can explain this further. You're saying that solar has really evolved so fast that it's actually might be putting the grid and the utility companies in jeopardy, which is a concern of yours. So why don't you take us through that thinking?
Sure. I mean, when you talk about any technology and its development, a technology that has sort of like a public application, there's sort of a transition point where from where it changes from a push that's coming from society, and that's sort of where the government started in the mid-90s after the Kyoto Protocols. Solar was sort of identified as a technology they wanted to support as an effort to reduce our emissions. But at some point along the way, the incentives were so good and the advances in the technology were so great that it's transitioned from a push to a pull. And now the industry itself, the technology itself is investing in itself. Complementary industries are investing in themselves sort of as a way to be on the ground floor of a disruptive technology. And so now that somewhere that transition happened, and now there's a pull happening where consumers now want this technology. They've always sort of had an adversarial relationship with their utility company.
I can't wait to kick them to the curb.
Right, and honestly, that's the wrong attitude. That's and that's been the result of the way the policies and the incentives were structured.
Yeah.
That didn't really take into account the possibility of this technology advancing so much so fast.
And you said we can't allow the utilities to fail before we figure out who will invest in, maintain, and manage supply and demand on the grid.
Right.
And that is why policymakers at the state and federal level who set this trend in motion must devise a solution that balances the competing interests until an equilibrium can be achieved.
I see
and by
now.
that,
I get the overview now.
And so you're actually saying that we're going to be in a lot of trouble if ever, and I see another side of this, and I'll get to that in a bit. I want to ask you how you feel about it. But it seems to me that we do have to worry because the main infrastructure supports a lot more than our little houses, right? And without us paying electric bills and all that infrastructure could fail unless there's a policy put in place that protects the infrastructure, which keeps the rest of us going. Right. So that's your premise here.
So what it's called is it's called distributed generation. So it's the idea that individuals can create generation and then feed it back onto the grid. The issue is if everybody does that, it's called grid defection, and it's sort of the idea of like fully removing yourself from the grid and just relying on your own systems. But grid defection is not actually a good thing. It's a bad thing for a number of reasons, primarily because it's not efficient. Individuals, household homeowners are not really qualified to judge today, for example, what their current energy use is or project 10 years in the future what their electricity consumption is likely to be. And so the outcome can be over or under investing in your system such that you either don't have enough electricity to do your own, to power yourself completely, or you generate too much and it has nowhere to go. So that's economically inefficient. And the other problem is it's a very capital intensive endeavor to go, a route to go by. And that tends to therefore be the forum solely for richer individuals and people with money. So if everybody leaves the grid, or if like a large proportion of people leave the grid, the people that stay on there are stuck with higher prices for energy, for retail electricity, which will then happen to be the poorer segment of the society.
Now, this is where government would be useful for a change,
right,
to solve a problem like that, because there's so many reasons why we should embrace this technology and forge ahead.
Yeah, and additionally, if you have like a well-functioning grid, you can solve that inefficiency problem. If somebody's under-generating and their neighbor is over-generating, they can actually sell directly to each other. As it stands right now, that's illegal in the state of Florida and in a number of other states as well. You're only allowed to sell electricity back to the utility and not directly to your neighborhood.
So you have a general understanding of the challenge, right? It seems to me that a solution probably will fall somewhere under the federalist sort of solution that we have running our country. We have a state solution, and we have a federal government and a state government, and the solution will fall where there probably is some infrastructure support coming from the government to keep things running, while there's certainly some incentive for people to turn green and use solar power and support themselves with as much electricity. But you have not come up with that policy.
Well, what I would say is, I mean, there's an excellent opportunity coming up at the federal level to make a change in the the regulatory structure. Specifically, the main incentive is the residential renewable energy tax credit, which provides 30% subsidy to homeowners for the cost of the system and the installation.
And it expires.
And it sunsets at the end of 2016. So that gives the federal government an opportunity to recalibrate those, potentially reduce the share that goes to homeowners to 10% and allocate the other 20% to the grid. The problem being in our system, as it currently stands, it's so adversarial that a compromise is always so difficult that the likely outcome in lieu of just letting it expire would be to extend it at like intervals, 1-year intervals, which is not obviously going to help.
Right.
And in the meantime, what you can sort of hope for is at the state level, there'll be some state level regulation and adjustment of incentives, because a lot of those actually do come from the state as well. But then you run into the problem of the lobbying aspect. And if you look at the state of Florida by itself, or as a test case, there's about 100 lobbyists that lobby on behalf of traditional utilities, fossil fuels, energy concerns that are national and international, like Koch brothers, for example, support a lot of the lobbying that goes on in Florida. That's compared to only 5 that lobby on behalf of solar companies, solar manufacturers, things of that nature. And that's why what you're seeing here in Florida is sort of like a battleground between the utilities that really see their bottom lines threatened by people leaving. Grid defection is not likely to actually occur. It's more like just the threat that their profits can't grow. Their revenues aren't growing as fast as they normally would. And so that sort of put them in a position to resist the technology.
I know we're not going to have time for this because we've got about a minute to go, but we can continue the discussion and we'll add it online.
Okay.
After the terrestrial broadcast. Sure. But the one thing I want to talk about is how governments around the world are dealing with this, because we seem to be falling behind. Mm-hmm. Anyway, we're going to continue with Douglas Bove, and we'll do it online at yakabouttech.com. But for now, we want to say goodbye and thanks for being here and listening to us. And you guys who are watching us right now, we'll see you soon. All right, I'm David Yak here. This is Yak About Tech, and don't forget, yakabouttech@gmail gets an answer directly from me. Or you can follow us on Twitter and at Yak About Tech. All right, this is David Yak here, Douglas Bove, and Sally Dillon. Bye.